into it, shall we? The United Nations Human Rights Council has adopted a resolution calling for a weapons ban on Israel and for Israel to be held accountable for possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in the Gaza Strip. 28 countries voted in favor, 13 abstained, and 6 voted against the resolution. France, which is among the countries that abstained from voting, described the situation in Gaza as catastrophic. This vote marks the first time the UN's top right body has taken a position on the nearly 6-month war. Meanwhile, Israel says it's approved the opening of 3 routes into Gaza to allow more aid into the territory. A statement by the Office of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, partly reads, Israel will enable temporary supplying of humanitarian assistance through Ashdod and Erez crossing, and an increase of the Jordanian assistance through Kerem Shalom crossing. The Erez crossing between Israel and northern Gaza has been closed since the October 7 Hamas attack. It comes as the United States President Joe Biden told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu an immediate ceasefire is needed to protect innocent civilians and improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. This was relayed in a tense phone call between the two leaders. A text released after the call with Mr. Netanyahu contained a warning that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza would change if Israel does not immediately act on those demands. The White House has, however, welcomed Israel's decision to open the new entry points. Secretary of State Antony Blinken lauded the move at an EU leaders meeting in Brussels. U.S. National Security spokesperson John Kirby wasted no time briefing reporters following the president's call with the Israeli Prime Minister. He noted that Washington's support for Israel remains ironclad and that the U.S. will not walk away from helping Israel defend itself.
I'm sure you're all aware, the president had a chance to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier today. On that phone call, the president emphasized that the strikes on humanitarian workers and the overall humanitarian situation in Gaza are unacceptable. He made clear the need for Israel to announce and to implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. He made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action on these steps. He underscored that an immediate ceasefire is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and to protect innocent civilians. And he urged the Prime Minister to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home. I'll let the Prime Minister speak to his side of the conversation. I would note that the Israeli Defense Forces, their Southern Command commander, has made a public apology for the strike. I think you can understand, but they did talk about a very public and very viable, real threat by Iran to Israel's security, and I think I need to leave it at that. It's really as far as I can go.
There have been more reactions to Israel's actions. The United Nations has described the development as positive news, but added it would have to see how this is implemented. UN spokesperson Stefan Dujarric says Israel needs to make sure that reopened aid routes are operational. UNICEF, on the other hand, says opening of the additional aid route is key to assisting people in northern Gaza, noting a notification and coordination system must be implemented. UNICEF spokesperson Tess Ingram says getting aid into Gaza is incredibly slow as there are lots of checkpoints. Much earlier today, the Israeli Defense Forces held a press briefing about the airstrike in Gaza that killed 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen. The IDF said it has sacked 2 senior officers from the unit involved in the incident from duties. According to the IDF, evidence from its initial inquiry has been passed to the Military Advocate General, the Israeli Army's top legal authority, to determine if there has been any criminal conduct. Its inquiry into the incident also found some workers survived initial airstrikes but were killed when a 3rd car hit. It says its drone operators mistook an aid worker carrying a bag for a gunman and then targeted one of the WCK vehicles with a missile. It also says 2 people escaped that vehicle and got into a second car, which was hit by another missile from a drone. The Israeli military says there were survivors from the second explosion who managed to get into the third vehicle, which was then also hit by a missile. But in the end, all the workers were dead. Reacting to this, the World Central Kitchen's chief executive, Erin Gore, says the IDF's apologies for the outrageous killing represent cold comfort for the victims' families and the charity. But Israel is going on ahead of Iran as it announces the opening of bomb shelters in Tel Aviv and several other municipalities. It comes over the possibility that Iran could retaliate following the airstrikes on its consulate in Syria, which killed several high-ranking military commanders. The equipped safe rooms have an underground parking lot for those residents who lack such facilities in their own apartment blocks. The Israeli military also temporarily suspended leave for its combat units a day after announcing it would increase recruitment and call up air defense reserves. The Israel Defense Forces indicated the decision to pause leave was made following a situational assessment. The Defense Forces, Iran has vowed to retaliate after it accused Israel of bombing its embassy complex in a deadly escalation of regional tensions over the war in Gaza, and once again appear to erase the risk of a wider Middle Eastern conflict. Iran says the attack left at least 13 people killed. On the humanitarian scale, Gaza municipality is warning diseases are spreading in the Strip due to waste pileup and sewage overflow as a result of the Israeli bombardments. Officials have called on local and international institutions to help improve the health and environmental conditions in Gaza and enable the municipality to provide services that aggression has caused near complete paralysis in. Health officials in Gaza have been warning of the increasing threat of infectious diseases as access to food and medicine remain impeded. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Red Crescent Society says the number of children who've died from starvation and dehydration in Gaza has now risen to 31. Staying with children, the United Nations Children's Fund says more than half of those in Gaza, 620,000 of them, are unable to attend school due to the destruction wrought by 6 months of war on the enclave's education system, noting that 8 out of every 10 schools in Gaza are damaged or destroyed, with about 10% of the facilities totally decimated. However, authorities say rebuilding the schools will be a simpler task than dealing with children's trauma and loss of education. The VOA's Ricky Rosson is in Tel Aviv. Ricky, thanks for joining us. Let's begin with the UN-adopted resolution calling for Israel to be held accountable for possible war crimes in Gaza. How impactful and effective do you think this is? We've already seen Israel defy previous UN resolutions.
Well, this UN resolution charging Israel with war was from the UN Human Rights Council, not the Security Council, which passed a resolution 2 weeks ago demanding a ceasefire. While the Security Council resolution could be a serious problem for Israel because they could impose sanctions, this Human Rights Council resolution will almost certainly be ignored by Israel, which has attacked this council for years for what it calls its hypocrisy and discrimination against Israel. The Foreign Ministry of Israel points to the fact that an overwhelming number of the Council's resolutions have been against Israel, while nothing has been charged against known human rights abusers like Iran, Syria, Russia, or anything said about the human rights abuses of Hamas.
Just a while ago, I read about the U.S. President Joe Biden's conversation with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, uh, during which he called for immediate ceasefire, which he says is needed to protect innocent civilians and also to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And I imagine that, there have been other calls like this from, leaders of other countries, the UK, Australia, Canada, who have also expressed, their displeasure, their anger about what has happened, the killing of the aid workers in Gaza who were going about their dutiful, their duties towards the Gaza people. Do you get the sense that, these allies are really angry at Israel for what it's done, for the deaths of these aid workers?
Absolutely. It seems that Israel's killing of the 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back for President Biden. He has been warning Israel for months to protect civilians in Gaza and improve the humanitarian crisis. And this tragedy shows, not only to Biden, but to much of the other international supporters of Israel, that in fact, Israel's war is not being waged in a way which protects civilians and aid workers, as Israel has claimed. In fact, more aid workers have been killed in this 6 months of conflict than in any other modern war, according to the American representative at the Human Rights Council of the UN. And the Biden administration has threatened to change its policy towards Israel if there are finally not concrete changes made by the government and the military. We don't know yet what that means, if it has anything to do with slowing the supply of weapons, but I imagine we will find out.
And I imagine, well, the Israeli government has announced those responsible for, these attacks on the aid workers. It says it's dismissed 2 officers, reprimanded 3 others for their role in the drone strikes, ruled out, what it is that transpired on that day. Is this explanation satisfactory to many Israelis who hear about, this, how these aid workers were killed?
In fact, there was an expose by an Israeli newspaper called Haaretz about that the war is being carried out in a chaotic and not orderly way. That individual commanders in the field have been making their own decisions, which have not been approved by their higher ups in the Army Command, and that this is the problem behind such tragedies as the killing of the aid workers, and a few months ago when the Israeli Army actually killed 3 of the Israeli hostages that were appealing to be rescued.
Just wondering, Ricky, if, aid work has resumed in Gaza, if you would know, because the UN did pause for 48 hours, it said, and World Central Kitchen also paused its activities in Gaza, so did the other aid groups. Has there been any talk about resumption of, some of those activities in light of the many people who will be needing this aid in Gaza?
I'm sure you reported on the response of the UN and UNICEF, saying that the changes that Israel is making and their acceptance of responsibility and their changes, they not only fired 2 of the commanders who were directly responsible for the killing of the aid workers, but reprimanded several others who are very high up in the military command. And so the hope is that this will be enough to assure aid organizations that Israel is serious this time about protecting them and ensuring their safety.
And since we're talking about aid donations, Ricky, the announcement about the Erez crossing into northern Gaza, what is the hope here? That aid will come into Gaza, or is this just for people to escape, the horror and the war going on in Gaza?
No, the Erez crossing, which goes into the north of Gaza, was in fact destroyed by Hamas militants on October 7th. And it was always a crossing for pedestrians, for Gazans coming to work in Israel, for foreign diplomats, journalists. It's the Keren Shalom crossing in the south of Gaza, which has always been used for trucks going in and out and aid deliveries. So it will take time, but the idea is to transform Erez into another crossing for aid that goes directly into the north of Gaza, although I'm sure it will take time on both sides of the Erez crossing to renew and transform the crossing for that purpose.
Staying with humanitarian issues, Ricky, I mentioned also the Gaza municipality warning about diseases spreading, across Gaza. I mean, the pileup of sewage, the overflow. I mean, these are real health challenges. We're looking at the possible breakout of cholera and diarrhea and even some more deadly diseases in some of these areas. As the IDF forces, advance on, the many towns and cities in Gaza, do they ever stand to think, the repercussions of, this war and the impact of it on ordinary people who have to live in these places even after?
It's hard to tell how much attention the Israeli military is giving to these very tragic and significant problems as they are conducting their military operations. For example, they recently finished a 2-week operation against Hamas militants who were inside Gaza's biggest hospital, Shifa, and they arrested and killed hundreds of Hamas fighters who were operating inside the grounds of the hospital. But at the same time, much of this major hospital was evacuated and destroyed. And this is at a time that, as you say, there are such drastic health problems, not only the amount of disease and the problems with sanitation, but what is seen as an impending famine, especially in the north of Gaza. So one answer to the crisis may be, and the army and the government have been trying to aid foreign organizations who are setting up field hospitals, such as the Emirati and the Jordanian field hospitals, and the French and the Italians have set up field hospitals on ships off the Gaza coast.
Ricky, thanks again for joining us on the program.